Hello, this is the continuation of the period one key concept part two, which said that contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange and significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic. Today, we're going to be looking at the fact that in their interactions, Europeans and Native Americans asserted divergent worldviews regarding issues such as religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. So this is called Three Worlds Meet. The first thing to understand is that neither side had ever encountered each other before. And so they brought into this misunderstandings. And these mutual misunderstandings often defined the early years of interaction and trade, as each group sought to make sense of each other. And over time, Europeans and Native Americans will adopt some useful aspects of each other's culture. So, to begin, there were a lot of things that the Native Americans did that the Europeans just did not understand. There were 1,000+ tribes in which they had things that seemed unthinkable to the Spanish, including polygamy, which is having multiple wives. There were some places that had human sacrifice. They took daily baths, which was not a European thing at the time. When Europeans tried to trade with them, Native Americans gave them furs. In exchange, they accepted trinkets, little things like glass beads, to which the Spanish just laughed at them and said, why on earth? We just are getting such a valuable thing in furs, and they're accepting these things that are just throwaways to us. They didn't understand. To a Native American, the land deserved our complete and utter respect. Spiritually, it was seen as being part of the world. They saw every living thing as part of this greater world, and there was no such thing as private property. Therefore, there was no such thing as transferring ownership. When the Spanish came and asked the Native Americans for their land deeds, Native Americans didn't have any because to them, the land belonged to everyone. When Native American tribes, such as those in the Great Plains, hunted the bison, they killed the animal and used as much of it as they could. They used the bladder for carrying water. They used the fur to create fur coats. They used the meat to eat. They used the entirety of the animal. But when the Spanish came, they simply decimated. They hunted for sport and left bison carcasses to rot out on the Great Plains, which led to conflict. When Europeans went down to places like where the Aztecs are, they saw skull racks. They saw cannibalism, and they didn't understand. And yet, at the same time, the Native Americans couldn't understand when the Spanish were talking about the Eucharist, where to them, they saw this ceremony as Christians eating their God. So you can understand there's a big, huge misunderstanding between the two sides. Gender roles were another concern because to Native Americans, they divided the land, and it was the women who were farming, in particularly in the East Coast, the Northeast area, Eastern woodlands, and the men went off to hunt. Well, in European areas, men did all of that, but men farmed the land for their food, and they would hunt for sport as opposed to for food. So that caused concerns. In fact, in as far ahead as 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville looks at North America as an empty continent, a desert awaiting its inhabitants. So they gave no concern to the people that were already there. You can understand why there was a misunderstanding between these different individuals. One of the things that happened when the Europeans arrived was that they sought to Christianize the peoples that they encountered. And this is just a small map of some of the missions that exist. You can see how many in California, and there's far more than that. This summer we drove by one that is not listed here, but it was in Solvang, which is along the route above Santa Barbara and before you get to San Luis Obispo. But there were these missions all over the place, and the purpose was to Christianize these individuals. And that's what was the idea. But the ideal isn't what happened. There's a lot of resistance that's going to come, and I'm going to tell you about two specific battles. There was a man by the name of Juan de Oñate, and he was the governor of New Mexico. His desire was not only to spread Catholicism with these new missions, but also to destroy the culture and religion of the Native Americans that were there. He was a particularly harsh governor. And in 1595, they began to fight against each other. We have the Battle of Acoma in 1599, where he demanded supplies, and when the Indians refused, there was a battle. 12 Spaniards died, a small number. But instead, in retaliation, the Spanish murdered 500 men and 300 women and children. Those that survived were often taken prisoner. And if you were a man over the age of 25, you might have your right foot cut off and be enslaved for 20 years. Women over the age of 12 were enslaved for 20 years. Eventually, the town was rebuilt in 1601, and it still stands to this day. Interestingly enough, I heard a story on an anniversary that there was a statue put into the town where this happened, and it was a statue of Juan de Oñate. And in retaliation, they cut off the right foot of the statue, because that is what Juan de Oñate had done to these men all of these years before. Pueblo Revolt is also known as Pope's Rebellion in 1680. And there were, again, harsh efforts to Christianize. There was oppression. This is one of the rebellions that is successful. So many of what we're going to talk about as far as Native American revolts are not going to succeed, partly because there are so many different tribes that are not united, and they're just not able to come together. They don't have a shared language or shared culture or anything. But this is successful. The Spanish leave until 1692. So for 12 years, they're gone. The missionaries had set out to destroy Pueblo culture, and the rebels decided to destroy churches that were created by the Spanish as well. When they do return, eventually in 1692, they see the benefit of creating a buffer zone between the more rich areas of California and the English colonists that are to, and French colonists that are to their east. Next, we have what's called African cultural preservation, or syncretism. And this is where you're going to have a blending of African religion as well as Christianity. You're going to have, in Africa, they practiced animism, which is worship of the animals and the spirits in nature that are going to happen. And when they combine this with Christianity, we get a couple of religions you may have heard of. One is called Santeria, and the other is probably more well-known, and that is called Voodoo. Finally, we end up with what's called maroon communities. This is where runaway slaves are going to go and create these communities in the Caribbean and Brazil. So as you can see, Native peoples are going to seek to defend and maintain their political sovereignty, and they're going to provide resistance to the Europeans as they begin to encroach upon their lands. Finally, we have a really important debate, and I need to go back a little bit before this and tell you about this, but this Valladolid debate is one of the great debates about humanity of the Native Americans. The Pope is going to declare them to be human. In 1532, the Spanish judge, Francisco de Vitoria, is going to say that Indians have reason, law, and government. In 1537, Pope Paul III will declare that Indians are not to be enslaved or deprived of property. Well, the Spanish king disagrees vehemently with this and decides to confiscate copies of the Pope's declaration, so nobody knows about it. In 1542, we have Bartolome de las Casas, who you're going to read about. He publishes an eyewitness account showing the cruelty of the Spanish. He had been a resident bishop in Chiapas, Mexico. 2 years later, in 1544, Juan de Sepulveda, who is the other man that you are going to read about, argues that conquest and just wars are acceptable. He said that Indians were irrational, inferior, and suitable for slavery. In 1550, King Charles, who was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, called together leading theologians and scholars. Theologians are religious scholars, to determine this question: what is the criteria for waging war against natives? He wanted to know, were they capable of self-government? This is where we get the Valladolid debate from 1550 to 1551. And this is one of the most important debates in Native American history. In 1554, Francisco Lopez de Gamarra, who had never been to America, disliked Indians, he wrote outrageous characterizations saying they were the worst people God had ever made and should be enslaved. They didn't deserve liberty. Finally, in 1573, the king issued laws about exploration, and the settlement and treatment was for pacification, not conquest. So it took a very long time for this question to be answered, and the idea to be that there would not be subjugation and conquest of them, but rather working to Christianize and help them. The final thing listed here is the Black legend, historiography. And historiography is how certain groups of historians view certain events. And it changes throughout history. You can take the same event and scholars 100 years later see it differently than scholars 200 years later, as an example. Well, Black legend historiography portrays the Spanish as brutal, ruthless individuals. And we get some of that information seeping into history as a category all by itself of this cruelty that you can see in it. Bartolome de las Casas talks a little bit about that cruelty and how it shouldn't be happening. And so this is going to be how a debate among European religious and political leaders about how non-Europeans should be treated is going to create changes, which included that shift from the encomienda system, where they were treated brutally, to the repartimiento system and other things like that. And that is the end of this video. Thank you very much.